Chapter 461. Godly Power of Infinite Resurrection. After initially being stunned, Xu Qing's expression turned somber. Something strange was definitely going on. The reason he had been going all out a moment ago was that the uneasy feeling from the blue-green dragon had only been getting more intense, to the point where he felt like his heart was full of trepidation. He just didn't believe that he could resolve such a deadly situation so quickly. Waving his right hand, he sent all the poison in the area toward Chu Tianquan's corpse. It gathered around both the head and the body, which began to rot. After barely more than 10 breaths of time passed, they became a black sludge that soaked the sand beneath it. However, the ceiling in the dome of heaven was still there. What was more, his feeling of unease also remained. Expression unsightly, he flew straight up into the sky and unleashed a powerful attack, hoping that he might be able to just break free. Just as he unleashed the attack, a sense of deadly crisis erupted in his heart. Swiveling, he looked back down at the ground. Golden light shone brightly in the area where Chu Tianquan had died. It rippled and distorted, seemingly changing the magical laws in the area. Apparently it was influencing time itself, as something unbelievable was happening. It was as if time was flowing in reverse. As Xu Qing watched, the black sludge seeped out of the sand and formed Chu Tianquan's head and body. Then, the head flipped back up onto the neck. All of the wounds Chu Tianquan had sustained vanished. His eyes opened, and he looked grimly at Xu Qing up in the sky. "I underestimated you," he said in a raspy voice, golden light swirling around him. "I never would have guessed that you also have god power." Chu Tianquan rolled his shoulders and took a step forward. At the same time, his cultivation base power surged. This time, it wasn't in the early nascent soul stage. It went directly to mid-nascent soul. Although that was an increase in one section of a larger realm, Xu Qing knew that after foundation establishment, every such upgrade created a massive difference. Usually, someone in a higher level could easily kill someone a single level below them. The sensation of deadly crisis continued to bubble within him. He knew he had to be wary of this power of resurrection. It was not some ordinary magical technique or divine ability. Nor was it a magical technique that could substitute for someone in death. Xu Qing got the sense that this really did contain the power of a god. "This experimental god body of mine is different from the other ones," Chu Tianquan said coolly. "And it's even more different from yours. My godly power is that of resurrection. Infinite resurrection." The truth was that if Chu Tianquan hadn't run into the great bird Qing Qin, who had miraculously injured him, then his cultivation base would have been immeasurably close to peak nascent soul. Qing Qin was an ancient mutant beast that possessed godliness. In other words, he was a high-level godly entity. His life force godlight couldn't interrupt Chu Tianquan's godly resurrection, but the injuries inflicted had forced his cultivation base to a lower level. And the effects lingered even after he resurrected. The recovery process was slow, and the effect on his cultivation base was massive. That was why he normally revealed an early nascent soul cultivation base. Looking at Xu Qing, he narrowed his eyes. "I was kind enough to explain some things to you. Now, why don't you tell me what your god power is?" Xu Qing didn't reply. Eyes glittering with killing intent, he tapped into the fleshly body power provided by the Shadow Fusion secret magic to shoot with incredible speed toward Chu Tianquan. He arrived in an instant. He was covered in blood, and his eyes radiated killing intent. He looked like a killing machine, and when he burst into action, the golden crow cried out, causing a 3,000-meter sea of flames to spread out as it dove toward Chu Tianquan from above. Taboo poison power erupted, along with intense mutagen. At the same time, the shadow also rose up, and Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior came in with the iron skewer. The Emperor's sword appeared in the golden crow's mouth as it shot toward Chu Tianquan. A rumbling like heavenly thunder echoed out everywhere. The ground shook, and the sky changed color as a golden beam of light appeared around Chu Tianquan. It expanded rapidly, becoming a covering that surrounded Chu Tianquan protectively. Meanwhile, Xu Qing shivered, coughed up blood, and kept backing up. The golden crow howled in anguish. Patriarch Golden Vajra warrior nearly collapsed into pieces, and the shadow grew dim. The emperor's sword also faded. However, at the same time, that golden covering surrounding Chu Tianquan trembled, and cracking sounds rang out as it began to break up. Taboo poison power covered everything, and Xu Qing made sure that it seeped in through those cracks. Chu Tianquan frowned as his body again started to rot. He had godliness, as well as god power, which meant that though he was difficult to injure with poison, he wasn't impervious to it. This is the same type of god curse that you infected Yunar with. Now that I've personally felt it, I can tell how terrifying it is. Sadly for you, you don't have perfect control of it. You can only use its external shell of power. Therefore, the methods I've prepared to deal with it are sufficient. Chu Tianquan stared at Xu Qing as the golden light around him collapsed. Then he performed an incantation gesture and pointed up with his right index and middle finger. Calamity. The air above him distorted as 9 vortexes appeared. As they spun, black coffins emerged from all of them. 9 coffins dropped from above and slammed into the ground. There, they split open to reveal 9 zombies. All of them looked mangled in some way, but they had all died in different ways. One had been drowned, one had burned to death, one had been disemboweled, one had bled to death, and one had died after their blood vessels all exploded. All had died grisly deaths of torment. And if you looked closely at their faces, it became obvious that they were all Chu Tianquan. Especially noteworthy was the fact that all 9 of the grisly zombies were surrounded by countless souls. They howled in grief, their voices spreading out everywhere. They were the souls of men and women, young and old. They came from 9 small human nations that Chu Tianquan had exterminated. Then he assimilated their souls and put them into 9 calamity zombies. The 9 zombies slowly looked at Chu Tianquan, then inhaled, causing the taboo poison in him to sweep out and into them. I nourished these zombies with the blood of countless of your fellow humans. I filled them with innumerable souls of your fellow humans. Coupled with a prayer to my God, they can share the calamity of an external god curse. Xu Qing, you have no idea the extent to which I prepared to kill you. Chu Tianquan looked at Xu Qing as he performed an incantation gesture with his right hand and pointed up with 2 fingers. At the same time he performed an incantation gesture with his left hand and pointed down. Finally, he pushed both hands in Xu Qing's direction. Attack! The 9 calamity zombies turned to look at Xu Qing, then became 9 blurs that raced toward him. Chapter 462. Embodied as a god. Rumbling sounds echoed out everywhere. Blood sprayed out of Xu Qing's mouth, and his expression was unsightly as he continued to fall back. It was the first time anyone had ever dispelled his taboo poison power, or at the very least, delayed it significantly. If it wasn't for Chu Tianquan's powers of infinite resurrection, then the poison would have been effective eventually. Regardless, Xu Qing could sense that his poison was still at work. Although Chu Tianquan could reverse time and resurrect himself, the poison had still seeped deep into his bones. That was one terrifying aspect of Xu Qing's poison. It had only been delayed. That said, if things kept going as they were, he wouldn't have time to wait for the poison to take effect. What was more, the 9 zombies had undying bodies. Whatever blows Xu Qing landed on them seemed to have no effect. From the look of it, the souls absorbed the force of the attacks. This was Chu Tianquan's method of delaying the poison. He sent the poison from himself into the zombies, and from the zombies into the countless souls. Although the souls wept and howled, Xu Qing could sense that they were pleased with what was happening. It was as if Chu Tianquan was what they put their faith in. It was as if Chu Tianquan was their god. In fact, that was one of the powers of a god. The 9 zombies were not only eternally indestructible, they also pulsed with early nascent soul fluctuations. One wouldn't have been too difficult to deal with, but 9 was pushing Xu Qing to a deadly limit. Seeing the danger he was in, his eyes flickered with cold light. He still had 2 trump cards he hadn't used. Both were most effective when they were first used. What was more, He would only have one chance to use the projection of the Ghost Emperor Mountain. The most important thing to deal with are those souls. Simply suppressing them won't do any good. I need to either destroy them, or subjugate them. With such thoughts on his mind, his eyes shone with determination as he reached out with his right hand and activated his Gruglum Dao seizing art. His hand immediately became semi-transparent as he shoved it deep into the pit of his own stomach. The icy hand entered him and stretched to his sea of consciousness, where he found his fourth heavenly palace, and within it, the violet moon. He could use the power of the violet moon by activating his heavenly palace. But that was like a small pony pulling a big chariot. Though the violet moon was a part of him, his power and control over it was limited. If he wanted to release its true potential, he had to do so directly. He had to take it out. As Xu Qing gripped the violet moon, veins bulged on his forehead, and pain filled his body. However, he didn't frown. Cool calmness filled his eyes, along with killing intent, as he pulled it out. As his fourth heavenly palace trembled, he extracted the violet moon and held it aloft. Boundless violet light spilled out from his hand, becoming like a sea of violet that spread in all directions. Wherever it went, everything turned violet, making it seem like the area had been separated from the rest of the world. In fact, it made it seem almost like a god domain. Within that god domain, violet light was god power, and the source of it, the violet moon, was the god. As the violet light erupted, Chu Tianquan's expression flickered. His heart started pounding. Godly authority. That's impossible. Golden blood sprayed out of his mouth, and tears of blood poured out of his eyes, which bulged like they might fall out of his skull. He began to shake violently, and his hands dropped to his sides. It looked like he was just on the verge of averting his face and dropping to his knees to prostrate. At the same time, he twitched and convulsed, as if his flesh and blood had their own will, and wanted to detach from him. However, he was an experimental god body, and the god power within him exerted a suppressing force that forced his body back into equilibrium. Given how Chu Tianquan reacted, it almost wasn't necessary to mention the calamity zombies. The zombies' eyes exploded, and they dropped to their knees, trembling. Howls of grief erupted from their mouths, and the mutagen within them soared to such heights it looked like they might mutate at any moment. At the same time, the mutagen invaded the souls attached to them, causing them to cease their shrieking and wailing. Instead, their expressions became that of unprecedented piety, filled with fanaticism and even faith. One by one, they began leaving the zombies and flying toward the violet moon in Xu Qing's hand. As the souls flew into the violet moon, the 9 zombies lost their main support, and began shaking so hard it looked like they might collapse. Chu Tianquan didn't seem like he could hold out against the taboo poison much longer. As the poison surged within him, he started rotting again. Killing intent filled Xu Qing's eyes. However, even as he prepared to continue with his current strategy, ripples spread through the dome of heaven, and a sensation of deadly crisis filled him. This sensation surpassed anything from before, filling him with an extremely disturbing sensation of inauspicious terror. Xu Qing's face fell. Up above, his heavenly Dao blue-green dragon emitted an anxious shriek. It was as if an indescribable entity had taken note of the aura of the violet moon, and was waking up to come search for it. The sky then began to change color, gradually becoming red. An image of a red moon appeared in Xu Qing's mind, along with a terrifying statue of a god. He also heard the same breathing he had heard back at the supreme beginning netherflight pillar. This was what Xu Qing had always worried about. After all, he was well aware of the origin of his violet moon. As the heavenly Dao blue-green dragon wailed, he unhesitatingly put the violet moon back into his heavenly palace. He also retracted his taboo poison pill power and used it to cover up any traces of god power. Having done that, he burst into motion, heading with stupefying speed toward Chu Tianquan. In the blink of an eye, he arrived, and the dagger in his right hand slashed toward Chu Tianquan's not completely healed neck. A moment later, blinding golden light erupted from Chu Tianquan's skin to block the dagger. It also created a backlash attack that sent Xu Qing flying backward, trembling and coughing up blood. At the same time, the rotting Chu Tianquan opened his eyes, looked at Xu Qing, then reached up and smashed his palm into his own forehead. A thump rang out as his head exploded and he died. Xu Qing scowled as he backed up, all the while looking up into the sky. The red light above was fading, and the heavenly Dao blue-green dragon was no longer wailing in anxiety. That caused Xu Qing to breathe a sigh of relief, as it was now obvious this taboo poison power had effectively concealed the aura of the violet moon. Next he flew up into the air, reached out, and directly ripped open the ceiling barrier. The barrier was immensely powerful, but his blue-green dragon existed at a higher level and had finally worn down the barrier. It ripped apart. However, the result didn't leave Xu Qing feeling very pleased. If his heavenly Dao blue-green dragon was as amazing as it was supposed to be, why had it taken such a long time to break through the barrier? Even though the barrier contained god power from Chu Tianquan, the process had still taken much too long. The blue-green dragon seemed a bit embarrassed. However, Xu Qing wasn't paying attention to that. After ripping open a section of the barrier, he was about to try another teleportation when he looked outside. That was when his heart dropped. The outside world did not look like a desert. The area beyond the barrier was a world of ever-present mist. The blue-green dragon let loose a cry that seemed to be an explanation, as if it were telling Xu Qing that this was why the process took so long. Xu Qing's eyes narrowed. Down below, time flowed backward and Chu Tianquan appeared again, just like before. That said, there were some portions of his face that hadn't recovered after his resurrection, and were still rotting. Other areas glowed with violet light. That was the result of the god power Xu Qing wielded. Even after being resurrected, Chu Tianquan couldn't wipe out those things. That said, all it did was make this resurrected Chu Tianquan look more vicious. "You actually broke through the barrier," he said. "Sadly. I prepared for that too. You really thought you were still on the revered ancient mainland? This place is the Smoke World, a place fully controlled by the Smoke Whites. It's not a minor world. Rather, it's a chunk of a major world from antiquity that was second only to revered ancient. The Smoke Whites made it their own. It's a precious treasure that surpasses even taboo treasures. I paid 100 drops of god blood to earn the right to enter it. And only one of us will exit. Either I die and you get out, or the other way around." Xu Qing looked down at Chu Tianquan. "In that case, I have no choice but to kill you." He blurred down toward Chu Tianquan. "Kill me." Chu Tianquan chuckled viciously, then dropped to a cross-legged position and performed a double-handed incantation gesture. Golden light sprang up around him, and at the same time, golden light shone from his eyes. Everything about him seemed golden, even his hair. A holy sensation emanated from him, and his expression was no longer vicious. It seemed apathetic, as if he had risen to a higher level of life, and no longer needed any emotions. Then he closed his eyes, faced Xu Qing, and started chanting something that sounded like a sutra. Follows the dark reversal Dao underworld surpasses God first period until supreme spirit darkness Yong Hop. As he chanted, the surrounding world started to tremble. This was no sutra. This was the chanting of a god. Chu Tianquan existed as an experimental god body, therefore, he could take words he had heard chanted, then use his god power to imitate them and transmit them to the world. Everything around him rippled and distorted, and then erupted with boundless mutagen. It invaded everything, mutated everything, and even created something from nothing by causing mutant beasts to appear. Xu Qing reeled as he was also affected. A mutagen that was not his own flowed through him. Een conceals Yong Height's essence virtue suppress pennant yellow watchtower. Rumbling sounds echoed out of Xu Qing as he fell from the sky, his eyes bloodshot as he stared at the chanting Chu Tianquan. Chu Tianquan already seemed blurry, as if numerous variants of himself were superimposed on each other. It made him seem like a god being embodied, that couldn't be seen properly. Xu Qing's mind reeled, and he gasped for breath. His body wasn't under his control. It was as if his enemy's voice had become corporeal. It was in his sea of consciousness, his mind, his Dharma force, his flesh. Everywhere. Splitting pain filled him. It was the exact same sensation he had experienced in the gassed hollow beneath the supreme beginning netherflight pillar, when that god's eye opened. Chapter 463. A box in a heart. There was a big difference between this situation and the gassed hollow. Back in the gassed hollow, when Xu Qing saw a real god, the invasion created by that eye affected the entire gassed hollow. That type of might was impossible to resist, impossible to sustain, and impossible to fathom. It didn't just break apart the fleshly body, it also affected the internal Dharma force as well as one's thoughts. It was as if it broke apart the entire living being. During that event, Xu Qing had felt like his entire being was collapsing. If it weren't for that centipede lady appearing and saving him, then he would have been in an unimaginable crisis. Even if he had somehow managed to get into that pentagonal log cabin to gain protection from the song that pacified the god, the time it would have taken would have involved severe injury to Xu Qing. And even if he survived, he would have experienced mutation and become like the ghasts that inhabited the gassed hollow. 1. However, this situation with Chu Tianquan, though similar in some ways, was actually poles apart. Chu Tianquan's chanting was being channeled through his god body, and thus it resembled the chanting of a god. But in the final analysis, he was not a true god, only an imitation. Even though the illusory projection of a god existed behind him, based on what Xu Qing had experienced in the gassed hollow, the situation was fundamentally different. Beyond all that, Xu Qing was a very different person than he was back in the gassed hollow. Xu Qing looked up, his eyes bloodshot but shining with a strange light. He looked at Chu Tianquan sitting cross-legged and emanating golden light. He ignored the way his body was distorting, with fleshy appendages sprouting out from him everywhere, swaying back and forth. His thoughts were clear. He had ways of fighting back against the god power of Chu Tianquan. They included his heavenly Dao blue-green dragon and the Ghost Emperor Mountain, as well as that bottle he had purchased in the Ghost Ward with the voice of the singing woman inside. All were tools he could use. And of course, he still had his taboo poison and violet moon. Ooh. That said, killing intent flickered in Xu Qing's eyes. He wasn't interested in fighting back against this opponent. He wanted to devastate him. He would use god power to crush god power. Or at the very least, he would try. And that was because seeing Chu Tianquan use the power of a god had given him some inspiration. Can I do the same thing? Although this fragmented world of the smoke white seemed like a place full of danger, it was also a destined opportunity. The power of the red moon had sought him earlier, making it clear to Xu Qing that if he used the power of the violet moon out in the open, he would be discovered. What if I just use a little bit, and keep it concealed within my taboo poison? If you add in the fact that I'm in this smoke-white world fragment. Xu Qing's eyes lit up with determination as he struggled to look up at the rift in the sky. He exercised a thought, and his blue-green dragon, which was still able to move freely despite Chu Tianquan's chanting, swished its tail and hit the rift. A boom rang out as the section that Xu Qing had ripped open subsequently closed, returning the barrier to its original state. Next, Xu Qing's gaze shifted back to Chu Tianquan, and he activated his third and fourth heavenly palaces at the same time. The mysterious and unfathomable taboo poison, which had originally come from a god domain, swept through Xu Qing, reaching every bit of his blood and flesh. All of the appendages which had started growing out of him rotted, turning into black gore that splattered on the ground. The sounds which had been boring into his flesh were also poisoned out of existence. They had no way to flee. They vanished, any resistance on their part absolutely pointless. Then the poison seeped out of him, flowing through the air and making the area surrounding him even more turbid and distorted. What was more, because the taboo poison power also contained his own mutagen, that mutagen flourished around him, spiraling out and making him seem like he had the very same type of unique life force as a god. Things weren't over yet, though. Next, Xu Qing sent the power of the violet moon spreading through his body. Where it passed, his flesh turned violet, until he was that exact color from head to toe. As a result, he began to glitter with scintillating violet light. With that violet light radiating out, another type of mutagen unique to Xu Qing was born. It was formed by the violet moon, and after invading living things, they became linked to Xu Qing. As all of these things swirled endlessly around Xu Qing, they became like a tempest that connected to the dome of heaven and devastated everything around him. Within that tempest, it was just possible to see the projection of a violet moon hanging in the sky. That was the embodiment of godly authority. It was the true power of a god. Behind the violet moon, within the violet world that now existed, there was a pair of black eyes that could not be invaded by any mutagen. The pupils of those eyes contained boundless taboo poison. There were two types of godly authority erupting from within Xu Qing. Though they weren't fused together, neither were they separated. Though they resisted each other, they also coexisted. And right now, both were emanating godly might that was uniquely their own. As Xu Qing emanated godly might, his expression was indifferent, and he exuded a supreme level of majesty, every aspect of which caused heaven and earth to shake violently. Eventually, thanks to the blessing of those two types of godly authority, he rose to an astonishing level. It was as if he had become the embryonic form of some new god. His shadow trembled, and Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior shivered. Without any hesitation, both of them appeared in the open and prostrated in front of Xu Qing. The Patriarch seemed profoundly reverent, while the shadow was filled with incomparable piety and fanaticism. Xu Qing slowly opened his eyes, which now glittered with golden light that spread around him and made him seem truly holy. The shadow bans, the ghost commands, the immortal declines, the world is mine. This was the fake mnemonic created by Patriarch Golden Vajra Warrior to disguise Xu Qing's use of the shadow fusion secret magic. Right now it didn't have any specific meaning or function. Xu Qing just said it because he felt like it. The shadow was briefly stunned, and then extremely excited. At the same time, Xu Qing's voice imparted the vague and indistinct sensation that the words spoken contained vast amounts of profound information and blessings. They had another deeper meaning, and as they echoed out, winds swirled and strange colors flickered everywhere. The surroundings began to ripple and distort as the transformations caused by the chanting of a god appeared thanks to Xu Qing. The ground shook, causing even the sand to vibrate and collapse. All sorts of supernatural phenomena sprang up around Xu Qing, and howling echoed out that seemed to originate from countless years in the past. Cracks spread out on the ground, and gory tentacles rose up. The entire world was changing, transforming, turning into something gruish and inauspicious. All living things were invaded, thrown into chaos, causing everything to shake and distort. The source of it all was none other than Xu Qing. The blessing of the two types of godly authority was not complete, only embryonic. But at that moment, Xu Qing had truly reached an astonishing level down to every fiber of his being. That was why, to some extent, his voice was actually a godly voice. Chu Tianquan's chanting was an imitation. But on a substructural level, what Xu Qing was saying was the real chanting of a god. Although it was not on the level of other gods, it was more than enough to crush Chu Tianquan. Chu Tianquan's chanting suddenly faltered, and what had previously been incomprehensible suddenly became easy to understand. The god first follows the dark path. The underworld surpasses the supreme spirit. Yang virtue conceals in essence. 3. As he inhaled, his eyes opened and he looked in shock at Xu Qing. Although he had continued speaking, the golden light around him had already collapsed. Because of that, a boundless mutagen suddenly erupted within him. His body started to collapse and his thoughts became isolated. Thanks to the words coming from Xu Qing and the mutagen, his chanting suddenly turned into a blood-curdling scream. In that moment of crisis, Chu Tianquan reached up and stabbed his fingers into one of his eyes, then wrenched it out of the socket. Golden blood sprayed out in a mist, spreading out around him to stave off Xu Qing's godly voice. Unfortunately, Xu Qing was also in bad condition. The sudden influx of shocking power was more than his fleshly body could sustain, and even as his voice rang out, his body started to collapse. That said, the experiment he had just carried out had given Xu Qing a clear understanding that the two types of godly power within him had much more to unveil. At the same time, they were extremely dangerous. Unless he became a lot stronger, then when he used them, the slightest misunderstanding on his part could lead to him perishing. Therefore, after crushing Chu Tianquan's chanting, Xu Qing unhesitatingly retracted the violet moon and the taboo poison. The violent tempest vanished, and heaven and earth returned to normal. Chu Tianquan's golden blood faded away along with his scream. As he struggled to get the mutagen within him under control, his expression turned vicious. Floating up into the air, he shouted, "You're obviously just a cultivator. A cultivator. How did you do that? How did you overcome me?" I refused to believe this. Chu Tianquan's face was splattered with golden blood. His expression was one of insanity as he glared at Xu Qing. Then he suddenly jabbed his right hand into his chest, grabbed his own heart, and ripped it out. Blood sprayed everywhere as he held the golden heart aloft and then crushed it. As the blood and flesh spurted out, a box was revealed in the middle of the heart. If Master Seventh were here, he would recognize it immediately. It was very similar to the box that the Crown Prince of Violet and Cyan had revealed, although close examination would reveal that it was much cruder. For, as soon as Chu Tianquan had it in his hands, he crushed it, causing a beam of light to appear. It was the gaze of a god. 5. When Xu Qing felt that gaze, a tremor passed through him, and he immediately felt his taboo poison and violet moon being suppressed. The beam of light didn't spread out in all directions. Instead, it materialized in Chu Tianquan's right hand, causing that hand to glitter with dazzling light. Then he shoved that hand in Xu Qing's direction and bellowed, "God magic, leave emptiness in the future." During this fight, Xu Qing had always been acutely aware that he was dealing with an experimental god body that surely had mysterious abilities. For example, Master Xiangyun's experimental god body had released an astonishing magic that, though it was ultimately defeated, had left a lasting impression on Xu Qing. The moment words left Chu Tianquan's mouth, Xu Qing felt his surroundings transforming. Images sprang up around him, hundreds if not thousands of them, and every single one depicted him. In some, he sat quietly in meditation. In others, he was fleeing for his life. He saw himself taking his last breath or wailing in anguish. The images seemed never-ending. They were Xu Qing's current future. As the images gathered, they formed something like a picture book. Chu Tianquan waved his hand, and the pages of the book blurred by. He seemed to be looking for an image of Xu Qing's future death, which he would then pluck out into the open and make a reality. This was God magic. Leave emptiness in the future. It was a very similar scene to what Xu Qing had experienced with Master Xiangyun. 6. The way he had dealt with that situation was to interfere with the future by taking his fate into his own hands. That said, Master Xiangyun's experimental god body had been incomplete, and therefore, that god magic hadn't been successfully employed. Furthermore, no box appeared at that time. Chu Tianquan was obviously holding nothing back. He had taken out the box and fused his hand with the gaze within, to Xu Qing's utter shock. However, there were two sides to every coin. Although this complete god magic was fully terrifying, to Xu Qing, it was also something of a benefit. At the very least, he was now able to sense what a god magic could do. And right now, boundless information was flowing into his mind. 1. The situation with the Gast Hallow, the guard, and the centipede woman were in chapter 369. 2. The scene where he got the bottle in the ghost ward started in chapter 388. 3. Compare Chu Tianquan's words now to his words in the last chapter, and you will see the connections/differences/similarities. 4. The box was actually mentioned a few times, but it was revealed publicly in chapter 313, and was used in chapter 314. 5. The word I'm translating, gaze, is a fairly common word that also means things like sight, vision, look, expression in one's eyes, etc. It also contains the word for light. If you literally translated each character, it would be eye light. So when the gaze of a god is described as a beam of light, it makes even more sense in Chinese than it does in English. 6. The final fight with Master Xiangyun's experimental god body was in chapter 326. Chapter 464. The Ghost Emperor arrives. It wasn't that he wanted to absorb the information. It began pouring into his mind because of the beam of light and the god magic. It was as if the bits of information were contained in the god magic and the gaze of the god. Xu Qing had no choice but to accept the information, and thus veins bulged on his forehead, and his head filled with intense pain. His eyes turned bloodshot, and then bulged as if they might explode. As Xu Qing was racked with pain, and as the information filled his mind, he suddenly came to understand something about the world. To the eyes of gods, the lives of all living things were like a picture book open for perusal. What happened when they looked at you was that your past, future, and everything about you were like countless pictures that could be flipped through, combined, or changed. Your every action, including the tiniest step forward, acceleration, or pause in movement, could affect the future by creating countless branching possibilities. Because of that, the pictures of the future contained countless variations. They were like a majestic river that formed the picture book of life. That picture book was so massive that mortals couldn't even sense its existence. Not even cultivators could do that, unless their cultivation base reached an extremely high level. And only someone at an apex level could possibly see the entire thing. That was because even just the pictures of one life contained information that most existing entities couldn't sustain, much less the collective picture book. When considering all of the living things in an entire world, and the world itself, it was simply too weighty to even imagine. The nearly infinite amount of information that would erupt out every single instant would create different levels of destruction based on the level of the cultivation base involved. That was one reason why gods couldn't be looked straight in the eyes. Gods had such picture books which contained, not just the future, but countless other pieces of indescribable information. The more information, the greater the weight. In some cases, a god might not even have any destructive intentions, but if a living thing looked at them, the unbounded information would be too much to sustain. It would affect that living thing's body, causing mutation and, ultimately, death. But as for the broken face of the god in the dome of heaven, he was different. When his eyes were closed, it was possible to look at him. Only when those eyes opened did an explosion occur. Perhaps compared to other gods that would seem like a weakness. But when his eyes opened, that gaze encompassed all of the revered ancient mainland, and could invade anything and everything. In fact, even other gods could be invaded. After all, when he gazed at something 3 times, it was called a god domain. It was very contradictory, and was seemingly incomprehensible. Such information inundated Xu Qing's mind, and that contradictory nature caused blood to spill out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. He shook from head to toe, and his blood vessels started collapsing. The hand fused with that light was absolutely terrifying. This was a godly authority that was completely different from that of the taboo poison and the violet moon. It was purer. A sense of deadly crisis sprang up within Xu Qing. He gasped for breath as he sent the power of the taboo poison and violet moon through himself, both to sustain himself and also resist the terrifying god magic. The surrounding pictures blurred, with some of them turning dark. It looked like the flipping of pages was slowing down. But the pictures didn't disappear. There was a deadlock between the two types of power, as they contended with each other. Up in the sky, Chu Tianquan looked down, his expression turning more vicious. He was putting his life on the line in his attempt to kill Xu Qing. And he was tapping into his very core essence to do so. The gaze within that box came from the heart of his experimental god body. And that body had been specifically designed for that box. Based on what he knew, the other 4 experimental bodies had been crafted similarly, yet none of them had boxes in their hearts. His was the only one. And that was also why he had been able to maintain his faculties in the experimental god body. Furthermore, when his essence exploded out in this manner, it would influence his resurrection ability. But he didn't care about that right now. What he cared about was that the picture book he had paid such a price to unleash was now turning blurry. Worse, it was becoming much more difficult to flip the pages. That was what he cared about the most, and it was also causing him to devolve into madness. He couldn't accept an outcome like this, and thus, he inhaled deeply. In doing so, He caused everything beneath his waist to wither up. All of the flesh and blood there disappeared. The bones melted. In the shortest of moments, his lower half turned into ash. As they vanished, the god power essence within them swept up into the top half of Chu Tianquan's body, converging in his throat, where it turned into a second beam of light that erupted from his mouth and fused into the god magic in his right hand. Instantly, his hand shone with blinding, dazzling light. At the same time, it surged with unprecedentedly powerful godly might. It was so bright it made everything else seem dim, and made him the only source of light in heaven and earth. The ground quaked. The world blurred. Everything twisted and distorted. And at the same time, Chu Tianquan extended his hand toward Xu Qing and then slowly clenched it into a fist. Die. 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 Xu Qing had just stabilized himself, only to suddenly feel himself reeling out of control. Countless pictures appeared around him, and instead of being blurry, they were extremely clear. Chu Tianquan's expression turned into one of wild hatred, and he let loose a hoarse howl. Swishing his right hand, he caused the pictures around Xu Qing to start flipping rapidly. He wanted to quickly find the perfect image. Xu Qing's pupils constricted as his organs, his flesh, his blood, his bones, and even his soul filled with indescribable pain. It was as if a red-hot poker had been plunged directly into his abdomen and then maliciously wrenched back and forth. Xu Qing spasmed. Blood sprayed out of his mouth. And his face turned pale white as he staggered backward. He felt death looming over him as he looked at the pictures around him and saw innumerable futures, all of them turning clearer and clearer. It looked like, within moments, one of them would be extracted. It was a picture of him shattering into pieces, losing everything, leaving behind only a head and bitter grievance. Then Chu Tianquan took that head to a grave in the Supreme Arbiter Salvation Mountains. There, he placed the head as a sacrifice in front of the grave. There was a name on the gravestone, clearly visible. Master Sheng Yun. There were some other branches of possibility attached to this future. In some of them, Chu Tianquan died. In some cases, he was killed by arch-immortal Plumdark. In others, it was Sir Bloodsmelter. In yet others, he died at the hand of Master Seventh. Sometimes he died at his own hand, and in other cases, he was killed by the Crown Prince of Violet and Cyan. In that critical moment, Xu Qing's eyes turned bloodshot. The gaze contained in that shattered box was full of boundless godly might. Beyond that, Chu Tianquan was obviously going all out. It was a deadly scenario. The only thing Xu Qing could think to do to resolve the situation was to crush his own future, and thus make it impossible for his enemy to change those pictures. Taboo poison and the violet moon aren't enough. In that case, let's see how you tamper with my future when I show you a smoldering god shouldering two major worlds. Xu Qing gritted his teeth and lifted his right hand. Instantly, 30 packed symbols from the Supreme Void World appeared in front of him. As they burned, an enormous mountain suddenly manifested behind Xu Qing. It started out blurry, but as the demonization symbols burned, it became clear. As it superimposed over Xu Qing, the mountain gradually came to resemble a humanoid form seated cross-legged in meditation. He wore a pitch-black suit of armor, and had an enormous blade resting in his hands. In front of him was the supreme beginning netherflight pillar, and two major worlds were on his shoulders. It was an image that seemed like nothing other than a wretched god. Every bit of the armor pulsed with destructive power, and the blade looked like something that could slice worlds apart. Endless animosity spread out from the mountain, creating spectacularly brutal fluctuations. They contained mad fury as they spread out to devour everything. The entire world trembled. The desert started to collapse, and even the air seemed to shatter. What was more, the facial features of the Ghost Emperor were about 80% similar to Xu Qing. Xu Qing was no longer visible. He had fused with the Ghost Emperor. And as that Ghost Emperor floated up into the air, a pair of eyes opened and locked onto Chu Tianquan. That godly gaze was like that of the sun or moon. It was dazzlingly brilliant, making the world brighter, and also causing waves of incredulity to batter at the shocked Chu Tianquan. Teach this. This is freaking gold core? Chu Tianquan was in a state of madness, but he was so astonished that he suddenly gained a bit of clarity. He looked completely flabbergasted. Never could he have possibly imagined that Xu Qing would be able to produce something as terrifying as this. 2 types of godly authority, plus the projection of a smoldering god with 2 worlds? Is that the Ghost Emperor? As Chu Tianquan reeled, the Ghost Emperor Xu Qing had summoned descended with crushing power toward the ground, and Chu Tianquan. A disdainful aura erupted from him, sweeping out everywhere, causing the ground to shatter. A miserable shriek erupted from Chu Tianquan's mouth, along with a spray of blood, as he was shoved downward. As the Ghost Emperor descended and blood erupted from Chu Tianquan's mouth, the countless pictures that had appeared around Xu Qing went from clear back to blurry. They went from bright to dark. And then they started vanishing. Winds screamed, picking up the rubble in the world around them. Chu Tianquan laughed bitterly as he looked up at the shocking figure dropping toward him. Sensing Xu Qing inside, he said, "You're using 2 types of godly authority plus a projection of the Ghost Emperor to crush me. Very, very impressive. Xu Qing, I might not be able to do anything about your future, but what about your past? If I erase your past, then the world will forget you." Chu Tianquan had already burned half of his body into ashes. And now he could sense that if he wanted to continue to use his god power essence, he would have to lose his power of infinite resurrection. But he was ready to use his god power to kill Xu Qing. Pointing downward with his hand that radiated godly light, he said, "God magic, leave nothing of the past." Chapter 465. What did I just see? The future exists in the imagination, but the past exists in memories. Therefore, if all vestiges of a person's past were to be wiped out, and if those who cared about that person chose to forget them, then it would be the same as if that person never existed. There would be nothing left behind. At that point, would that person even have existed? And even if they did exist, what would it mean if no one knew about them and no one remembered them? Perhaps they would really disappear. They would have no name, no past, no future, no anything. That was another ability of gods. The power over the past. Forgetting. As Chu Tianquan yet again burned his essence, the ancient world fragment of the Smokewites went absolutely still, like it had been paused. Chu Tianquan's fleshly body also stopped moving, as did the descending Ghost Emperor Mountain. Everything went quiet, as if it had frozen in place. Only Chu Tianquan's soul, which was surrounded by godly light, could do anything. It flew out of his forehead, becoming the only moving entity in the world. In that form, he looked up at everything, his expression one of reverence. "This is leaving nothing behind," Chu Tianquan murmured. This was his first time using the apex-level god magic. In his view, this version of heaven and earth looked different from the real version. The dome of heaven didn't exist. The land didn't exist. Nothing existed. Even the Ghost Emperor Mountain was nothing. Not even his fleshly body seemed like it really existed. There was only a wisp of fog, floating there, which was Xu Qing's previously held location. When Chu Tianquan saw that wisp of fog, he knew that was where he needed to go. All he had to do was find the memory doors of people there that remembered Xu Qing, and close them. Then this god magic of leave nothing of the past would be a success. Without any hesitation, Chu Tianquan in soul form rushed toward that fog and then entered it. Within that boundless fog, he found innumerable doors. Some were large, some were small. Some were round, some were square. There were all types. Some were new, some were old. They all seemed to be made from different materials. They were densely packed, and almost resembled a long tunnel. "This is the place." Chu Tianquan threw out both his hands, and his soul erupted with godly light that became numerous sealing marks. Those sealing marks then flew toward the doors to close them. Most of the doors started to fade beneath the sealing marks. They blurred. But other doors weren't willing to be sealed. After fading briefly, they became clear. But the godly power was so immense that they had no choice but to darken. Every single one of these doors represented memories of Xu Qing related to some living being. As they blurred, Chu Tianquan's soul flew faster, following the tunnel of doors, emanating godly light to seal them. The process seemed to be going smoothly, causing visible excitement to appear in Chu Tianquan's eyes. But then, Chu Tianquan encountered one particular door that was round. As the sealing mark of godly light reached that door, it didn't blur at all. In fact, when the godly light touched it, the door slowly opened wider. Inside was a blood-red eye that, once the door was open, stared at Chu Tianquan. At the same time, the entire path rippled and distorted. Godly power erupted out, causing Chu Tianquan's soul to let loose an agonized shriek. In that critical moment, his soul's right hand exploded, causing scintillating godlight to defend him as he shot backward. When he reached safety, his eyes flickered with lingering dread. He knew full well that the eye was that of a god. This was one reason why he had waited until the most critical juncture to use god magic. Leave nothing of the past. The effects of the magic were far-reaching. Some people might be more than willing to forget what they knew about that person, while others would be unwilling. The latter would be obstacles to Chu Tianquan. At the same time, it made him susceptible to notice from the outside world, which could cause big problems. Furthermore, it was also possible to provoke heaven-shaking, earth-shattering misfortune. After all, he knew quite a bit about Xu Qing, and he knew that if he encountered some terrifying entity by using the magic, it could cause a major backlash to him. He had to put all his trust in his godly essence, and hope that if Xu Qing did exist in the memories of some terrifying entity, that it wouldn't influence his own god power. After all, he didn't need the effects to be permanent. He just needed the world to be temporarily bereft of anyone who remembered Xu Qing. That would give him the opportunity he needed to cut Xu Qing down permanently. Xu Qing does have god magic, so it would make sense for his memory doors to link to a god. Thankfully, my godly light helped me deal with it. Besides, I don't need to seal all the doors. As long as I don't fail with more than 10 of them, my god magic will be complete, and I can inflict a grievous blow. Eyes shining with determination, he continued on his way, sending out seals of godly light in all directions. But this time, he hadn't even sealed 30 doors when, all of a sudden, he reached another door that slammed open. Chewing sounds echoed out from inside. The sound was nightmarish, to the point where those who heard it might turn insane, as if they were hearing themselves being devoured. An agonized shriek erupted from Chu Tianquan, and he instantly detonated one of his soul's legs, turning it into dazzling godly light. It's fine. He has 2 types of godly authority, so it only makes sense that 2 of his memory doors would lead to gods. Chu Tianquan trembled, but managed to break free. However, 50 doors later, there was another door, the color of blood, that slammed open. Boundless redness erupted from inside. How could there be another? Astonished, Chu Tianquan detonated another of his soul's legs. He was now starting to wonder if he should continue. Then, just up ahead, another door slammed open. Breathing sounds echoed from within, causing Chu Tianquan's soul to tremble. His eyes widened as he noticed something unimaginably large inside the door. It radiated might, and provoked a shrill scream from Chu Tianquan as he considered detonating his arm to defend himself. Heavenly Dao. Chu Tianquan's soul was now half gone. It had no limbs. In his terror, he looked at the tunnel and realized that he had barely progressed down 10% of it. The portion beyond that almost seemed endless. It was hard to see what lay in the depths, but he was fairly certain he could see a huge chair. What's a chair doing there? Trembling, Chu Tianquan decided he couldn't continue onward. Something's off about this Xu Qing. Something's very off. Even as Chu Tianquan reeled in intense shock, another door up ahead opened of its own accord, and a gory hand stretched out, surrounded by blurry distortions. Chu Tianquan screamed as he detonated more of himself to flee. But then, something happened that filled his mind with a heavenly tempest of astonishment. Banging sounds echoed within the tunnel ahead, and they were coming from countless doors. They were coming from the insides of those doors. It was as if there were terrifying entities behind those doors who had smelled something delicious, and were now going mad with a desire to emerge into the open. This. Chu Tianquan in soul form trembled violently, and he looked over his shoulder, contemplating if he should flee or not. He reacted slightly too slowly, as those countless doors slammed open. An agonized scream echoed from Chu Tianquan's soul as he instantly exploded. A moment later, Chu Tianquan returned to reality. A blood-curdling scream escaped his lips as the other half of his body collapsed. The godly light couldn't stop it from happening, and a moment later, all that was left behind was his head, which tumbled to the ground. His expression was one of terror, shock, and disbelief as he screamed and screamed. At the same time, everything that he had paused before went back to normal. Xu Qing shivered as he recovered, and then his face turned dour. He wasn't sure what had just played out, but the sight of Chu Tianquan's screaming head caused his eyes to turn icy. Then he sent the Ghost Emperor Mountain smashing down toward Chu Tianquan again. Chu Tianquan began to laugh bitterly. He knew he'd been defeated. He had lost his resurrection powers. He had lost his life. He had lost everything. All of the doors he had sealed with his god magic had been restored. His previous actions had done nothing. I can't fight back. I can't win. As Chu Tianquan's vision began to blur, he yet again laughed bitterly. Then he cried out, Xu Qing, you should know that I'm actually just a vessel. When her appears, you'll still end up dead. Xu Qing's eyes narrowed, but the Ghost Emperor Mountain continued to descend, rumbling loudly. But then, Chu Tianquan's withered forehead suddenly split open, and a semi-transparent hand stretched out that did not belong to him. The hand was as white as snow, and had no hairs on it. It almost looked like it was carved from white jade. It abounded with holiness, but was also completely gruish. That sensation of two things mixed together caused wild colors to flash in heaven and earth, and make the entire world tremble. The hand waved toward Xu Qing 3 times, causing 3 gusts of wind to appear. God magic, always cherish this life. It was a calm yet unfamiliar voice. It contained boundless might, and it echoed from Chu Tianquan's forehead. And after the hand waved 3 times, it dissolved into ashes. Chu Tianquan's head listed to the side, leaving him gasping. As for the 3 waves of the hand, they unleashed a devastating might that was difficult to put into words. The first gust of wind noiselessly brushed against Xu Qing's Ghost Emperor Mountain. The Ghost Emperor Mountain rumbled, and its energy consumption skyrocketed. In the blink of an eye, the demonization symbol was drained, and the mountain vanished, revealing Xu Qing sitting there cross-legged. The second gust of wind caused Xu Qing to shiver. Inside of him, the taboo poison and the violet moon slowed down, and all of the color of life faded from him. He became only black and white. It wasn't just him. Everything in the area lost its color, and turned completely black and white. It was like a painting. And Xu Qing himself looked like he was part of that painting. An intense sensation of deadly crisis erupted in him, leaving him feeling extremely alarmed, as if death were approaching him. After becoming a part of that painting, he began to wither. In the blink of an eye, he became skin and bones, as if his life force were about to be eradicated. He couldn't form the Ghost Emperor Mountain. He couldn't release taboo poison or the violet moon. His life lamps and everything else about him were part of that painting. The only thing that remained was his heavenly Dao blue-green dragon, which anxiously rose into the sky and transformed into a falling saber. Unfortunately, it was too small to do much, and was shoved away, screaming. The third gust of wind landed on Xu Qing in the painting, and it began to spread through him like water spreading through canvas. Xu Qing couldn't move. His thoughts moved slowly. With great effort, he looked down and saw that the third gust of wind was spreading out, slowly turning him into nothing but a blotch of random ink. The piece of life-saving jade his master had given him shattered. Yet it couldn't stop him from slowly dissolving. The feeling of death filled him. Xu Qing was absolutely silent. He had used all the tools at his disposal. The current situation didn't seem overly desperate. Yet he had exhausted his god magic. His other divine abilities were simply too weak to deal with something of this level. Taking everything into consideration, the fact that he could end things in mutual destruction with this enemy went to show how deep Xu Qing's assets were. Am I going to die now? He was losing consciousness. His body was fading into nothing. Except right then, in that black and white painting, a thread of golden light flickered on his wrist. The golden light glittered as it grew brighter and brighter. Normally speaking, it wouldn't have been so dazzling. It was hidden too deeply. But the painting contained only black and white, so it became extremely prominent. It was the third color in the painting. The painting suddenly trembled. Golden light spread out over Xu Qing's right arm, and in the blink of an eye, had covered his entire body. During that moment of extreme crisis, it dispelled the third gust of wind from him. Then there was a dull thud. The golden light darkened. The painting ripped open, and an emaciated figure stumbled out, coughing up blood. The golden light faded as it returned to his wrist. Eventually, it disappeared from sight. However, just before it was gone, if you looked very closely at it, you would see that there were innumerable cracks in the golden thread. Xu Qing gasped for breath. He had been severely injured. He was incredibly weak. But he still forced his head up and looked at his right wrist. His heart was pounding, and his face was a mask of complete confusion. A moment passed, and his expression became extremely cold. He looked at Chu Tianquan. Chu Tianquan was like a lantern flickering with its last bits of oil. As death neared, he forced his eyes open. You're not dead yet. Xu Qing strode up to him. Standing over him, he sensed that Chu Tianquan had lost his ability of infinite resurrection. Looking very tired, Xu Qing lifted his foot high, then let it drop. Chapter 467. Linger's Life Essence Thread, Part 1. In Xixing County, in a location not too far from the county capital, there was a teleportation portal that flared with dazzling light as Xu Qing emerged. His face was pale white. He was dangerously weak, but without a moment of hesitation, he raced off into the distance. Once away from any prying eyes, he found a random cave in some remote mountains. Inside the cave, he coughed up a huge mouthful of blood. He was having trouble seeing as he sat down cross-legged and gasped for breath. Yet that didn't stop him from clenching his jaw and performing an incantation gesture to lock down the area. Based on his past experiences, a single day should have been enough to recover by half. Unfortunately, he was currently only about 10% recovered. As his internal organs pulsed with intense pain, he sent his senses inside himself to look at the reason why he was recovering so slowly. His internal organs were all cracked and on the verge of falling apart. His flesh was extremely withered, and his bones were all deeply fractured. That was the source of the pain he felt. As for why he felt so dispirited, it was because his sea of consciousness was dim and his soul wasn't glittering brightly like usual. That said, such things didn't count for much for Xu Qing. This wasn't his first time sustaining grievous injuries. Instead, what captured his attention was that, in addition to all those other injuries, he could see innumerable hair-thin needles inside of him. The needles actually didn't have a corporeal form. They were made of countless shattered bits of light that had spread throughout Xu Qing's fleshly body and skeleton. They glittered brightly. It was the needles that were impeding Xu Qing's recovery. Thankfully, the needles were only in a handful of locations on his bones, with most parts of his skeleton free of their effects. The power of a god, he murmured. His expression turned steely, and his eyes glittered with ferocity. As a matter of fact, he had spent some of his travel time trying to extrude the needles. Although he'd had a measure of success, the process was extremely slow. He didn't have time to do it the slow way. The reason was that the feeling of unease from his heavenly Dao blue-green dragon hadn't ceased after Chu Tianquan's death. In fact, it was getting stronger. Because of that, he just kept getting more and more anxious as he journeyed back toward the county capital. What was most telling of all was that as he got closer to the capital, the sense of crisis was reaching truly astonishing levels. That led Xu Qing to the conclusion that the sense of crisis was related to the county capital. Thinking back, he remembered that the first time he'd experienced that sensation was when he was in the capital. The next time was after he'd left the Holy Tide lands. That second time, the sensation was more intense, and it kept getting stronger the closer he got to his destination. Given that, it seems that the sense of crisis I experienced in the desert wasn't related to Chu Tianquan. Instead, it was because I was getting closer to the county capital. But why? Xu Qing couldn't come up with any ideas. And regardless of the reason why, he needed to recover as quickly as possible and get his battle prowess back to peak condition. Waiting wasn't an option. This entire situation was one reason why he hadn't just immediately rushed back into the county capital. If I want to recover quickly, I have to resort to special tactics. He took a deep breath and his eyes shone with determination as he activated his third heavenly palace. The power of taboo poison erupted, filling every fiber of flesh in his body. He wasn't trying to fight back against the needles that had resulted from Chu Tianquan's god power. Instead, he was using the power of the poison to cause his flesh to rot. Without any hesitation, he pulled out a dagger, sliced it into his arm, and began carving the rotten flesh off. After revealing the needles of light beneath, he used the dagger to scrape them off his bones. The sound of the blade scraping against bone echoed in the cave, and the pain increased by several times over. Xu Qing shivered, and sweat began rolling off of him. This was the best method he could come up with. The reason was that the needles were continuing to spread, though slowly. Therefore, by using the poison to rot his flesh, it made it easier to scrape off the flesh and cleanse it. It also slowed down the needles. Xu Qing was a vicious person. He was vicious to his enemies, and even more vicious to himself. Time passed. Xu Qing worked without pausing for a moment. As he scraped flesh off bit by bit, he eventually reached his right wrist. That was where the golden light was. He didn't want to activate the power of that golden light again, which meant he had to avoid reaching a state of near death. After confirming the golden light wasn't being affected by the light needles, he made sure the power of the violet crystal was restoring the flesh in that area before he moved on to other parts of his body. Using this process, he took 4 days to remove all of the light needles. During that time, he used both medicinal pills and the power of the violet crystal to make sure he was constantly recovering. There were light needles in his sea of consciousness as well. For those, he gritted his teeth and used the combined power of the violet moon and the taboo poison to force them out into his flesh. Then he dug them out with the dagger. When it was all done, he opened his eyes. The process had involved unimaginable pain, but the result was that he was now recovering fully. After another 3 days passed, he felt that he was back to normal. He emerged from the cave and looked up to see it was evening. Taking a deep breath, he mulled over the current situation. Finally, his expression became one of determination. He blurred into motion toward the same teleportation portal he had used previously. He still planned to go back to the county capital. For one thing, he wanted to trade the Dao fruits in for military credit. Also, he needed to collect more demonization symbols from the Supreme Void World. Later that very night, he stepped out of a teleportation portal in the county capital. He looked around the familiar city, including the huge statue of ancient Emperor Dark Serenity, and suppressed the jumpiness in his heart. Hurrying back to his sword pavilion, he settled down cross-legged and sent a message to the captain. He got no response. Obviously, the captain wasn't back yet. Next, he messaged Archimmortal Plumdark to let her know he was safe. She responded immediately, sounding concerned. Then, shortly after, she appeared outside his sword pavilion. Moonlight framed her as she stood there in a blue gown looking at him. She seemed worried. "Why were you gone for such a long time?" She examined him head to toe, and finding no injuries, she breathed a sigh of relief. "I ran into an issue on the way back," Xu Qing said softly, clasping hands respectfully. "It caused some delays." She nodded. She had other matters to attend to, and given that Xu Qing wasn't in trouble, she offered a few parting words before turning to leave. Before she could take more than a few steps, Xu Qing suddenly said, "Arch Immortal, I've been feeling extremely uneasy recently. Please take care of yourself." She stopped and looked back at him. She smiled and nodded. Then she left. Once alone in his sword pavilion again, Xu Qing messaged Kong Xianglong and asked if anything unusual was going on in the county capital. Kong Xianglong responded that everything was as normal, with the exception of the Nightshade Godchild situation with the holy tides. Kong Xianglong actually wasn't in the capital at the moment. He was out on a mission. But now that he was in touch with Xu Qing, he asked about what happened in Holy Tide territory. Oh, that. Right. There were some other nightshades there too. Xu Qing cleared his throat and didn't go into any more detail about that. That said, he didn't feel the need to be too secretive with Kong Xianglong, so he continued. I ended up getting a few thousand Dao fruits though. Kong Xianglong's gasp echoed out from the command sword to fill Xu Qing's sword pavilion. A few thousand. Yeah, and some of them are your share, Xu Qing replied. Now that's what I call a bro. Xu Qing, don't go and sell those Dao fruits. With the 10 entrails tree gone, those things are going to skyrocket in value. Hehe. Swordsage are all on the same side, but sometimes you just have to fleece the flock. Xu Qing wasn't surprised by Kong Xianglong's suggestion. Although Kong Xianglong was completely loyal to the Swordsages, there wasn't anybody who didn't need more military credits. The two of them chatted briefly, then ended the conversation. Xu Qing put down his command sword. Everything's normal here in the county capital, but this is definitely the source of my unease. Does that mean there's someone here who's targeting me? He was convinced that he wasn't overthinking things, so he didn't let his guard down by an iota. The night passed uneventfully. The next day at dawn, Xu Qing took extra precautions to remain safe as he left his sword pavilion and went up to the city to replenish his supply of medicinal pills. Then he went to the subsidiary sect of the Supreme Void Demonization sect. After paying the required military credits, he entered the Supreme Void world. Regardless of the sense of crisis he felt, he needed to have the Ghost Emperor Mountain ready as a trump card. And though the mountain was already set into his heavenly palace, he still needed demonization symbols if he wanted to summon it externally. The upside was that having the Ghost Emperor Mountain in his heavenly palace made it much easier to control. Since Xu Qing was a familiar face in the eerie Supreme Void world now, his presence caused quite a stir among the whispering brain trees there. Wherever he went, the brain trees trembled and fled from him. The last time, Xu Qing had been nothing short of vicious. Though it had been a while since he was here last, clearly word about him had spread among the brain trees. That said, Xu Qing's cultivation base was far more advanced than last time. No matter how the brain trees fled, he could catch up to them. And thus, it wasn't long before he left the Supreme Void world feeling very pleased. 75. Patting his bag of holding, he left the subsidiary sect and went to the Swordsage Palace's library hall. His hope was that he could find some information about that golden light, and where it might have come from. Unfortunately, there seemed to be no end to the books and scrolls in the library hall, and even after browsing late into the night, he didn't find anything helpful. Finally, he went back to his sword pavilion. I'll go back to the library tomorrow to keep looking. There has to be an answer there. If I can't find it though, I guess I'll report for duty at the corrections division and ask the palace lord for help. Worst case scenario, I can just stay in the corrections division for a while until I figure out what's going on. Although he might be in danger in the county capital, if there was one safe haven for him, it had to be the corrections division. After all, the palace lord was in charge there. With that thought in mind, Xu Qing settled down cross-legged and closed his eyes. It was a dark night with clouds and fog that obscured everything. After doing some breathing exercises, Xu Qing opened his eyes and looked at his right wrist. A moment passed. He rubbed his wrist with this other hand. Just what exactly is that golden thread? Xu Qing heard a peal of thunder off in the distance, and then the sound of rushing wind, which almost resembled weeping. A storm was coming. That was why it had been so dark throughout the day. It wasn't possible to see the moon outside, as it was covered by seemingly endless clouds. More thunder crashed, like the cry of gods. Occasionally, bolts of lightning would illuminate the county capital. Chapter 467. Linger's Life Essence Thread, Part 2. Lightning also illuminated the mountainous jungle habitat of the wood spirits. The wind raced through the trees, causing them to sway back and forth. Then the rain started falling, pattering onto the leaves in the huge basin. Within that wind and rain, an anguished howl echoed out, piercing through the sky, causing anyone who heard it to feel their scalp tingling. It was a cry of deep anguish and heart-rending grief. As it rose from within the wood spirit's basin, neither the thunder, nor the wind, nor the rain could stifle it. A bolt of lightning fell, revealing a figure with disheveled hair racing frenziedly out of wood spirit territory. It was an old man. His eyes were bloodshot and tears streamed down his cheeks. A bitter smile twisted his face, and he struggled to stop himself from trembling as he sped toward the county capital with all the speed he could muster. The rain fell in torrents all night. Around dawn, it let up a bit. A haze of water vapor obscured everything. It was almost as if the light of dawn was sick, making it seem more like evening than morning. Some distance from the corrections division was Xu Qing's sword pavilion. Inside, he opened his eyes and ended his nighttime session of cultivation. Getting to his feet, he walked out of the sword pavilion and into the rain. "I'll go to the library hall first and see if I can find out anything about the golden light. It's too bad I can't communicate with that boy from D-132. I bet he could give me some clues. Although, if I can at least get some clues in the library hall, maybe I can ask him for confirmation." Floating up into the air, he headed toward the Swordsage Palace. Before long, he landed on the soaked limestone tiles of the Swordsage Palace. Just as he was about to head into the library hall, his expression flickered, and he looked off into the distance. An anguished old man with bloodshot eyes was currently racing toward the Swordsage Palace. As he flew, he shouted in a mournful voice, "Xu Qing, Xu Qing, Xu Qing." Not only was he shouting as loud as he could manage, he was boosting his voice with his cultivation base. He was none other than the innkeeper from Plank Spring Way. He didn't know exactly where Xu Qing was, but he did know that Xu Qing was a swordsage. Therefore, as soon as he got close enough, he just started shouting at the top of his lungs. His heart and mind were in such chaos that he had lost control, and was hardly himself. Before he could get very close to the Swordsage Palace, numerous beams of divine will locked onto him and prevented him from moving forward. The disheveled innkeeper hadn't spotted Xu Qing off in the distance. As he hovered in midair, he looked around at the unfamiliar county capital and screamed in a voice that mixed rage with desperation and sorrow, "Xu Qing! Get out here right now!" His cries echoed out so loudly that quite a few swordsages looked over and frowned. What was more, some of the swordsages on patrol flew in his direction. Arriving in front of the innkeeper, they noticed the crazed look in his eyes, and kept their guard up as they stood in his path. "Explain this ruckus," one of them said. "I'm looking for Xu Qing. Please, I beg of you, help me find him. I have an extremely urgent matter to discuss with Xu Qing." "Calm down. Wait there for a moment and we'll forward your request." Inside the Swordsage Palace, Xu Qing looked at the old man being blocked by the guards. He recognized him immediately. His sudden arrival was unexpected, and beyond that, he and Xu Qing had something of a complicated history. As Xu Qing tried to decide what to do, the innkeeper shrieked, "There's no time. We don't have time for this." The old man seemed to be losing his mind. "Xu Qing. Xu Qing. Where are you? You have to help. You really have to help. That golden thread on you." The innkeeper was shaking, and he looked like he might begin to weep tears of blood at any moment. However, before he could rave any further, the sound of a rushing wind emerged from the Swordsage Palace. A moment later, Xu Qing was there in front of the old innkeeper. He waved his hands to tell the guards to back up. The surrounding swordsages clasped hands respectfully and made way for him. Xu Qing had no time to return their salutes. Eyeing the innkeeper, he said, "What did you say about a golden thread?" The innkeeper rushed forward as if to grab Xu Qing. Xu Qing. Xu Qing, you have to come with me. You have to save Linga. Xu Qing avoided his grasp and looked at him coldly. Explain yourself. The innkeeper looked haggard and extremely stressed, but he managed to pull himself together. He was aware that Xu Qing had no idea what was going on with Linga. What was more, given how cautious Xu Qing was, there was no way he was just going to run off because the innkeeper asked him to. Xu Qing, that golden thread on you is some of Linga's life essence. She's almost dead now, just because she wanted to save your life. There's no time to spare. You have to come with me. I'll explain along the way. The innkeeper turned and started racing away. Xu Qing just stood there, stunned. The golden thread on his wrist was a secret that only he knew about. It was an incredible gift that he had never explained to anyone. All of a sudden, he was having trouble breathing steadily. He wasn't sure how the innkeeper knew about the golden thread, or what other elements to the story there were. But right now, Xu Qing just couldn't keep calm. He took a step forward and then shot after the innkeeper. As he sped along, he asked, "Linga's life essence?" Linga. The girl from the Merfolk Isles. The name Linga was vaguely familiar to Xu Qing. He remembered that incident in the Merfolk Isles in which a young woman had given him some living mutagen. However, after that one chance meeting, he'd never seen her again. You don't even know who Linga is," the innkeeper said bitterly. Sorrow filled his eyes, and incredulity in his heart. "You foolish girl. Silly, foolish girl. How could a girl as foolish as you exist in this world?" Xu Qing wasn't sure why, but the innkeeper's words caused his own heart to sting. He was about to ask more questions when the innkeeper turned and glared at him. His eyes were so bloodshot that they glowed red. Gritting his teeth, he said, "Linga is my daughter. She's that white snake you saw with me. You met her when she took human form the first time in the Merfolk Isles. That golden thread on you is some of her life essence. She blessed you with destiny aura, to help you forestall calamity. If you die, she dies. But if she dies, nothing happens to you." Xu Qing's mind spun. "Linga already suffered injuries 3 times because of you. 3 times. If you don't believe me, search your memories. The first time was over 2 years ago. The second time wasn't very long after the first time." Xu Qing's mind reeled under a barrage of astonishment, and he found himself breathing heavily. He remembered all of it. The first time that golden light appeared was 2 years ago when he was in the sea zombie ancestral land, and used 7 Blood Eyes taboo treasure to find a spot between life and death. That was when he'd found his 121st Dharma aperture. During that moment of life or death crisis, he'd noticed a flash of golden light. Not long after that, after he and the captain went to the 3 Spirits Tao suppressing mountain, he'd inserted the taboo poison pill into his 3rd heavenly palace. During that near-death experience, golden light had again flashed on his wrist, giving him a new lease on life. These were all seemingly random destined opportunities that had resolved dangerous situations. 3. And there was a 3rd time, the innkeeper shouted, his eyes shining with grief. "It was only a few days ago. I don't know what happened to you, but you must have been in some sort of deadly crisis. How do you think you survived all those things?" "Well, it was Linga. And now, in the middle of trying to accept her legacy, she gave her life for you. Last night, she failed at her legacy." The innkeeper started sobbing. Meanwhile, Xu Qing was trembling from head to toe, and was reeling mentally. It felt like he was being hit by hundreds of thousands of lightning bolts. No, millions or possibly even billions. As a youth, his life had been one of bitterness, and he had struggled to survive in a brutal world. That was why he never felt safe until his enemies were dead, and it was also why he sought revenge over the smallest grievance. But at the same time, he never forgot the kindness shown to him. That was why he cared so deeply about Sergeant Thunder, Grandmaster Bai, Master 7th, and also Master Sixth. And now, out of nowhere, he was suddenly coming to realize that he owed a massive debt. She gave her life for me. Xu Qing's heart pounded harder than he ever remembered as he turned and looked at the innkeeper. Grabbing the weeping old man, he said, "What happened to her?" Xu Qing's grip was so forceful the innkeeper's arm emitted cracking sounds. However, the old man didn't seem to notice the pain. In fact, it seemed to give him a bit of hope that Xu Qing might agree to help. After all, it seemed to show that Xu Qing cared. Her legacy failed, so her soul fell into the abyss. Umbrellas suddenly appeared above Xu Qing's head. The Hell Spirit Bloodwing lamp manifested on his back. His heavenly Dao blue-green dragon roared beneath his feet. His shadow spread out to cover him, causing him to pulse with fleshly body power that surpassed the 10 palace level. "Point the way," Xu Qing said in a hoarse voice. Keeping a firm grip on the innkeeper, he shot off at top speed. He moved so quickly it was almost like a teleportation. An ear-piercing boom filled the air as Xu Qing moved as fast as he possibly could. As he passed, the sky trembled, the ground quaked, and shockwaves rolled out. Because the wood spirits isolated themselves from the rest of the world, they did not build teleportation portals. That said, they didn't live very far from the county capital. That was why it only took the innkeeper about half a night of travel to reach the capital. But Xu Qing was capable of much greater speed than the innkeeper. Less than an hour later, the wood spirits basin was just ahead. 1. Linger introduced herself to Xu Qing during the grand competition on the Merfolk Isles in Chapter 127. Prior to and subsequent to that event, he only saw her in snake form, and didn't connect the two identities. 2. The taboo treasure and spot between life and death was in Chapter 319. 3. The third heavenly palace situation was in Chapter 340. Chapter 468. A major world on Emperor Ancient Spirits Corpse, Part 1. Within the basin, the tree-form wood spirits opened their eyes and looked at Xu Qing. On countless tree leaves were the young wood spirits, who looked sorrowful as the rain fell everywhere. They didn't block Xu Qing's path. They just allowed him to proceed to the enormous tree in the middle of the basin, carrying the innkeeper with him. The temple door there was open. Inside, Xu Qing glanced at the statue but didn't study it closely. The innkeeper led him to the secret tunnel, and they started down the stairs. In the dark tunnel, the innkeeper's labored breath echoed out. The innkeeper was racing as fast as he could, but it seemed slow to Xu Qing. Xu Qing shoved him forward, adding a burst of speed so that they soon reached the end of the stairs, and the altar above the abyss. As soon as Xu Qing was on the altar, he looked around and spotted the cave 3,000 meters away, and the cross-legged figure in white. She was a beautiful young woman with a flawless face. She seemed peaceful and innocent, except at this moment, her face was pale and she wasn't moving. Dried blood was caked on her mouth, chin, and garment. The sight caused Xu Qing's heart to flip-flop, and filled his face with mixed emotions. He recognized her immediately. This was indeed the naive, innocent young woman he'd met in the Merfolk Isles. He remembered how she'd skipped up to him and asked a very strange question. "Elder brother, do you A, like snakes in general, or B, like eating snake gallbladders?" Xu Qing thought back to what the innkeeper had told him along the way. This young woman was that very same white snake. He could still remember the last time he saw her, back at that inn in Seven Blood Eyes. That little white snake had wrapped around his wrist. "One. Right wrist," he murmured. "Golden thread. Life essence." He looked at the young woman in white, who lacked any sort of life essence. He thought about the price she had paid for him, and suddenly felt guilt deep in his heart. This was too great of a kindness. And yet, Xu Qing couldn't understand why she would do something like this for him, considering she had only been in his presence a few times. He had experienced wonderful things in his life, but they all had a reason. For example, Sergeant Thunder had seen him gathering corpses to cremate them, and had felt it represented warmth in a chaotic world. Later, after Xu Qing saved his life, Sergeant Thunder treated him like a son. Grandmaster Bai had noticed how much Xu Qing was interested in plants and vegetation, and how he thirsted for knowledge. Thus, he had passed on his own wisdom to him. Master Seventh had admired how Xu Qing acted, and thus gave him a chance to prove himself. He had watched as Xu Qing walked the long path to stand in front of him. That was how Xu Qing had won Master Seventh's approval. But there was no explanation for Linger's actions. Xu Qing had never once met a person like this before. "Why?" he whispered as he looked at her. The innkeeper stood next to him, his eyes full of sorrow as he looked at Linger. "Because she loves you." Xu Qing didn't say anything. The innkeeper sighed, and his face full of wrinkles made him seem even more bitter. "Xu Qing," he continued softly, "there are some things in life that you can't explain in just one way. There are things you can't judge by a single standard. I know you don't understand what I mean, but believe me, if you think that all good things in life need a logical reason to back them up, well then, Xu Qing, you're locked into a very dead-end way of thinking. There are many types of love. There's not just one uniform way it happens. Sometimes love is about being devoted to someone. Sometimes it's about cherishing someone. It can be about admiration or sometimes mutual pain and sorrow. Occasionally love is about being attracted to someone, while other times it's about chasing the past. There are all types of people in this world, and all types of things. Thinking that your way of living is the only correct one, well, that's narrow-minded. Only when you can accept other ways of living can you really grow up. The innkeeper was deeply anxious, but at the same time, felt he needed to explain things clearly. He needed Xu Qing to understand that there were things in the world that didn't have a good explanation. They happened without a sound reason to back them up. After all, that understanding would be critical to rescuing Linger from the spirit abyss. Xu Qing listened to the innkeeper, and it struck a chord deep within him. He started trembling with emotion. Looking at Linger, he said, "How do I save her?" "She has to be saved within 7 days," the innkeeper said, trying to remain calm despite his anxiety. He looked at Xu Qing. After Linger's legacy failed, her soul fell into the spirit abyss below. Soon, her flesh and blood will start to wither until she's nothing but a corpse. Using my sealing abilities, I've locked her flesh and blood in place, but it won't last more than 7 days. And 1 day has already passed. You have to bring Linger's soul back from the spirit abyss before the time limit is up. The innkeeper looked at the abyss beneath the altar. Outsiders can't enter the spirit abyss without a spirit abyss talisman. Unfortunately, the last known talisman was used years ago, and the person who went inside with it never came out. What's more, I'm not Linger's birth father. I'm not even an ancient spirit. That's why I can't go inside. The only people who can enter are ancient spirits or people whose life force is connected to one. That's why you're the only one who can go find her. Ancient spirits. Spirit abyss. Xu Qing had heard about the ancient spirit species before, but knew that now wasn't the time to ask for details about them. Boo. There was a 7-day time limit, and 1 day had already passed. Xu Qing looked at the innkeeper. "Do you have jade slips with information about the abyss? If so, give them to me. I'll study them shortly." The innkeeper took out a handful of jade slips and handed them to Xu Qing. Indicating one in particular, he said, "That will get you back here." He went on to explain briefly how to use it. Then, it was with pleading eyes that he said, "Please. Linger gave her life for you, so you must save her." Xu Qing looked over at Linger and thought back to the 3 times she had saved his life. He nodded. Then he walked to the edge of the altar and, without the slightest hesitation, jumped off. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared into the abyss. Cold air swirled past him, into him, making him feel like his flesh and soul would be frozen solid. Looking down into the abyss, Xu Qing tapped into his cultivation base, sent his shadow stretching out in all directions, and released the power of his taboo poison. Only then did he examine the information the innkeeper had given him. Information poured into his mind as he dropped down, giving him a clear understanding of everything related to Linger and the spirit abyss. Countless years in the past, long before the time of ancient Emperor Dark Serenity, there was another species that conquered the revered ancient mainland. They were the Ancient Spirits. In his later years, Emperor Ancient Spirit gathered the collective power of his species as well as destiny aura to do something that shook all of revered ancient. It was related to heavenly Daros. Emperor Ancient Spirit was unlike the later Woe Immortals, or any of the more than 3,000 species that came earlier. Instead of trying to create a heavenly Tao, he wanted to become one. And the way he did it was to try to possess an existing heavenly Tao. Creation was a virtue. Possession was a rebellion. Emperor Ancient Spirit failed, and thus the revered ancient mainland suffered a backlash from the heavenly Tao. The bloodline of his species was cursed. In the final critical moment, Emperor Ancient Spirit used his terrifying cultivation base power to transport most of his people to another major world, in an attempt to avoid complete catastrophe for his species as a whole. Despite his efforts, his people failed to avoid the curse. Emperor Ancient Spirit perished. His major world withered, becoming a world of death. The ancient spirits within it all died. However, there was more to the curse than just simple death. The power of the curse caused all of the dead ancient spirits to be transformed into deceased souls that howled in anguish day and night. That withered world of death became the deceased ancient spirit world, where the effects of that curse caused endless torment. And that kingdom was forever buried in the depths of revered ancient. The spirit abyss in the wood spirit lands was only one entrance that led to the major world originally created by Emperor Ancient Spirit. There were other entrances in other locations. Although the ancient spirit species as a whole was cursed, their bloodline still existed in scattered places in revered ancient. And thus, descendants of Emperor Ancient Spirit would occasionally pop up. As Xu Qing descended into the abyss, he occasionally spotted skeletons stuck in the walls, other descendants of the ancient spirits who had attempted and failed at seizing their legacy. There was a good reason for such descendants to make such attempts. After the ancient spirit species was transformed into snakes, the curse to their bloodline made life difficult. They lived in a state in which their blood vessels could collapse at any moment. Thus, they would eventually go to the nearest entrance to the deceased ancient spirit world, where they would attempt to use the power from that world to suppress the curse in their blood. Only then could they assume human form. Sadly, the ancient spirit species were a pitiable lot. Throughout their lives, they would have to come back to the ancient spirit world to renew the suppression of the curse. Every single time they did that, they faced great danger. Those who failed would have their souls devoured by the ancient spirit world, and they would become deceased souls there. After studying the information, Xu Qing looked at his right wrist and sighed. Then his eyes glittered with determination, and he accelerated downward. He was like a shooting star that picked up speed as he entered the icy depths of the abyss. He felt a force of expulsion pushing against him, but because that life essence thread was from an ancient spirit, it didn't affect him. He held nothing back as he sped to the bottom of the abyss. Eventually, he noticed some colossal creature below, surrounded by mists. It was a gargantuan decomposing snake that pulsed with a strong aura of death. Resting atop the head of that dead snake was a major world. It wasn't possible to see the world clearly, but howls of grief echoed from it. As those howls pierced through the mist and reached Xu Qing's ears, he felt a powerful gravitational force latch onto him and drag him toward the major world. The closer he got, the larger the snake became, until it was so big he couldn't even tell it was a snake. All he saw was that world, filled with screams of anguish that got clearer and clearer. Eventually, he slammed into the greater world, causing a rumbling sound to echo out in all directions. A crater appeared on the ground. A moment later, Xu Qing strode out of it and looked around. 1. Linger asked him the question in Chapter 127. He last saw her in snake form in Chapter 168. 2. The ancient spirits were mentioned in Chapters 430, 431, and 455. Chapter 469, Ku. The bridal procession moved along the underworld river, accompanied by the piercing Swona music, which sounded like a dirge of the dead. The 4 jugs on the palanquin rods were each a different color. They were blue, black, red, and white respectively. They appeared to be some sort of tribute. Xu Qing hovered in midair, taking in the scene, his eyes glittering coldly. Then, he moved toward the palanquin. His arrival immediately attracted the attention of the line of escorts. 8 of the snake-headed humanoid soul shadows turned in his direction, their gazes full of malice. Xu Qing's expression didn't change at all, and his eyes were fixed on the palanquin alone. As he neared, the underworld river rumbled, its aura spreading out like countless sharp blades to slash at him. The 8 soul shadows flew toward him, yet as they neared, the wind blew taboo poison over them, and they screamed as they started melting. However, before they could completely dissolve, they merged together, turning into a gigantic 3-meter-tall soul shadow. Stretching its arms wide, it lunged toward Xu Qing. Then a rumbling boom echoed out as the soul shadow lurched to a stop in front of him. Cracks spread out rapidly over its form, and then it exploded. Chunks of countless soul bodies rained down onto the underworld river. Xu Qing expressionlessly retracted his fist and continued on his way. However, just as he was about to reach the bridal procession, it suddenly popped like a bubble, completely disappearing. A moment later, it reappeared in the distance, where it continued onward without a pause. However, a fair hand reached out and pulled aside the palanquin curtain. Then the young woman inside looked out, her eyes as cold as a viper's as she stared at Xu Qing. This was the first entity Xu Qing had encountered that didn't seem crazed. That said, the young woman was clearly off in some way. Her expression was pure coldness as she looked at Xu Qing. Meanwhile, a few dozen of the snake-headed soul shadows turned and rushed maliciously toward Xu Qing. He ignored them. Keeping his eyes on the palanquin, he lifted his right hand and pointed toward the sky. Rumbling echoed out as a tempest of poison descended, landing right in front of the palanquin, blocking its path. Xu Qing stepped onto the underworld river, and a violet mist spread out from him, seeping into the river and changing its color. At the same time, it locked down everything it touched. The wedding procession blurred as if it might vanish again, but thanks to the taboo poison and the violet moon, its teleportation failed. A shrill cry echoed out, and the procession stopped in place. All of the soul shadows then turned, glared at Xu Qing, and charged toward him. The underworld river seethed as a horde of zombies climbed to the surface, as well as a host of malicious souls. Xu Qing ignored all of that. Instead of slowing down, he continued onward. The black iron skewer appeared next to him, glittering with lightning as it shot toward the souls. It closed in on one, pierced it through the forehead, and sent lightning exploding out. The soul detonated. The shadow also spread out in vicious fashion and devoured the nearest souls. Because of the patriarch and the shadows, the souls that were rushing towards Xu Qing let loose piercing screams as they were either exploded, destroyed by poison, or devoured. At no point did Xu Qing stop or slow down. As masses of souls were destroyed, he got closer to the palanquin. Occasionally he would reach out and grab a nearby soul, then crush it. As he proceeded, his aura became increasingly terrifying. All the while, the piercing Swana song continued, becoming a penetrating soul power that formed an attack against Xu Qing. However, a power like that counted for little to Xu Qing considering he could chant like a god. As his black umbrella appeared overhead, he ignored the Swana and continued forward. The Swana music then changed, shattering. An agonized shriek rang out. Souls were being destroyed constantly around him as he proceeded forward like a fiendish god, completely unstoppable. Finally, the palanquin curtain flipped open as the young woman in the wedding dress flew out, her expression cold. She pulsed with fluctuations very close to the nascent soul level as she flexed her fingers, which had long, sharp nails almost like talons. Her eyes were fixed on Xu Qing. But then patches of black appeared on her face, which became like rotting snake scales. She moved with incredible speed, and was surrounded by a powerful aura of death. 1. However, as she closed in on Xu Qing, he suddenly disappeared from in front of her. Before the snake woman could react, a hand shot toward her from the side, latching onto her neck like a vice. It was Xu Qing's hand. The snake woman shivered as the hand unleashed astonishing strength. A loud cracking rang out as her neck was shattered. Xu Qing tossed the snake woman off to the side. She didn't vanish. She just screamed as she flew through the air, struggling. Before she could land, the taboo poison tempest swept her up. At the same time, the violet mist wrapped around her, locking her in place, sealing her. All of this takes some time to describe, but it happened at the exact moment the snake woman neared Xu Qing. Xu Qing had no time to pay attention to the screaming snake woman. As he strode up to the palanquin, and specifically the white jar, the crumbling golden thread in his palm emitted incredibly intense heat. Xu Qing carefully reached out and took the white jar into his hands. He opened it. A soul floated out of the jar, like mist, which swirled into the shape of a tiny white snake. It was somewhat blurry, as if it wasn't complete. Xu Qing looked at the white snake and could envision the young woman in the white gown, seated in meditation in the cave by the altar. The little white snake looked very weak. She struggled to open her eyes, but didn't have the strength. Xu Qing carefully reached out. The little white snake sensed him. Though she couldn't open her eyes, she shivered and instinctively settled onto his palm. She rubbed his hand amiably. Xu Qing's heart softened. He carefully closed his hand over the snake, then looked at the other 3 jars. They also had souls in them, just not Linger's soul. He could only assume that they were other ancient spirits who, like Linger, had experienced legacy failure and had fallen through the spirit abyss into this major world. That said, Xu Qing didn't want to leave anything to chance. He waved his hand to open the 3 jars, and saw souls of 3 different colors emerge. After closely examining them, he confirmed that none of them were parts of Linger's soul. Finally, he looked toward the area that was locked down by the violet mist and his poison. Then he thought back to what he had seen with the snake woman and the palanquin. She must have been absorbing the souls. That was one reason why Xu Qing hadn't just wiped the snake woman out of existence. He'd had the distinct feeling that the jugs on the palanquin were some sort of offering. Eyes radiating icy cold, he walked toward the snake woman. His shadow spread out behind him, and the black iron skewer followed at his side. Taboo poison rolled to the side to create a path for him, and the violet mist did the same. The snake woman's soul body was in a state of collapse, but her expression was still one of cold indifference. It was as if she only had a bit of emotion in her, and nothing resembling thinking ability. As Xu Qing looked her up and down coldly, the golden crow appeared. Flames raged as the golden crow looked at the snake woman and inhaled deeply. Her soul body shivered, then collapsed and turned into a soul mist. Within that soul mist were a few soul strands of various colors. One of them was white. Xu Qing used the Gruglum Dao seizing art to turn his hand transparent. Then he reached into the soul mist and carefully extracted the white soul strand. He put it onto the little white snake. The white snake shivered and became a little less transparent. Then she slowly opened her eyes. Looking confused, she said, "Ku, ku." Xu Qing's heart stung with pain as he realized that Linger's eyes were filled with nothing but confusion. She clearly was still incomplete, and it looked like she was about to fall asleep again. Xu Qing focused his senses on the golden thread, and quickly realized that it was pointing toward the depths of the underworld river. That was where he would find the next piece of Linger's soul. Xu Qing looked toward the depths of the river. He heard a deep rumbling growl from that direction, something that caused his soul to shiver. It also caused the entire underworld river to vibrate, making it seem almost like there was a god deep in the river, breathing. He felt a sensation of endless danger within him, growing stronger by the moment. It caused him to tremble. It was almost as if every inch of his flesh was warning him that there was something very dangerous there. The sensation became like a haze surrounding his heart and mind. Xu Qing looked down at the little white snake sleeping in his hand, and then looked back into the depths of the underworld river. After a long moment, he used the Gruglum Dao seizing art to gently put his right hand into his own chest. When he reached his sea of consciousness, he opened his hand, depositing Linger's sleeping soul there. That was currently the safest place for her. Having done that, he started moving further down the river. Maybe there was danger there, but he would face it. He would never let down anyone who had treated him with kindness. As he proceeded, the growl from the river echoed around him. After listening carefully for a while, he raised his hand and pointed to the dome of heaven. Suddenly, a violet moon appeared in the darkness above the major world. It was surrounded by a mist of poison. As it shone, violet filled the lands below. This was the first time for countless years that any moonlight had shone onto this major world. 1. Obviously, traditional red wedding dresses can come in all sorts of styles, just like traditional white wedding dresses can. However, they do conform to a sort of general style. Here's a small gallery showing a few examples. Chapter 470. An eye hidden in the canopy of heaven. The underworld river water was pitch black. As it flowed, countless faces could be seen floating within it, letting loose eternal howls of grief. In life, they had been members of the ancient spirit species. But they had been cursed, thus making it impossible for them to rest in peace after death. Instead, they wallowed in endless anguish. They had long since lost any form of intelligence, and only had their instincts left. That was their tormented existence. Their cries were piercing and mournful. Most who heard that cry would feel extremely uncomfortable, to the point where it would eventually destabilize their mind. But Xu Qing got used to it after about a day. Right now, he was on the river looking up at the dome of heaven. In the misty, evening-like sky, his violet moon sent out violet moonlight. Surrounding the moon like a veil was a cloud of poison. As he looked at the moon, the corresponding heavenly palace within him operated at full force, causing a violet light to glimmer in his eyes that was like a reflection of the moon. Eventually, he looked back toward the depths of the underworld river, which pulsed with terrifying fluctuations. Although the source was far away, he still felt deep apprehension. Only gods could create a feeling like this within Xu Qing. Is Emperor Ancient Spirit actually not dead? Xu Qing thought back to when he'd descended to this major world, and the gargantuan snake he'd seen. There had only been a single major world on that snake, which made it very clear that it was in only the first stage of the smoldering god level. There was no way someone in that level could have conquered all of revered ancient. Such doubts didn't cause Xu Qing to slow down. Instead, he accelerated. 3 days passed. During that time, roughly 10% of the sky over this world had become violet. As a result, the lands below looked increasingly violet. And as Xu Qing continued on his way, his own mutagen built up around him. Gradually, a violet mist surrounded him, spreading out continuously. From a distance, it looked like an inauspicious entity was arriving surrounded by an insidious cloud. This was the first time Xu Qing had used the violet power in this way. Because of the violet moon, the deceased souls in this major world began to behave differently. They were increasingly crazed. The invasion of the violet moon was provoking the curse within them. During the 3 days that passed, Xu Qing encountered many strong zombies and vicious souls. The souls in the underworld river were different from the ones he had encountered on his journey through the wastelands before. They had personal territories, and as long as they didn't leave them, they were completely undying. But what that meant was that as long as Xu Qing kept his distance, they wouldn't chase him. After coming to realize that, he didn't waste time tangling with them. He just avoided them. Thus, he got closer and closer to the true depths of the underworld river. On the eve of the 4th day, Xu Qing's expression suddenly flickered. The river water ahead of him suddenly seethed as a nascent soul aura erupted from within. As the water sprayed everywhere, an enormous face rose from the river. It was fully 30 meters in size. Many parts of it were rotting, and those that weren't were covered with gray scales. As the water poured off of it, the face's eyes locked onto Xu Qing as if examining him. Apparently, it sensed something it was looking for, as the face distorted, letting loose a howl of grief and indignation that caused the water to explode. A foul wind swept across Xu Qing, causing his swordsage uniform to ripple loudly. Frowning, he turned to avoid the area, except that a second face emerged from the river, just to the left of the first face. It was also 30 meters in size, and looked very similar to the first face, and was connected to it by a thin stream of black mist. As it rose from the river, it blocked Xu Qing's path. Things weren't over yet. A third face appeared, then a fourth. Eventually 11 faces had risen from the underworld river, creating an arc that completely blocked Xu Qing. The howls of the 11 faces shook heaven and earth, and also sent Xu Qing tumbling backward a few dozen meters. Then, the water beneath him exploded as the massive head of a decomposing bird appeared. Next came its wings, stretched out on either side, dripping water. After flying up into the air, it shot toward Xu Qing. Xu Qing's pupils constricted as he took in the zombie bird. Its body alone was 300 meters long, and it vaguely resembled a phoenix. It was in a state of deep decomposition, and was stabbed through with all sorts of nasty weapons. As for the 11 faces, they were its tail feathers. What Xu Qing took the most seriously was that hanging around the huge bird's neck was a necklace of black flesh, holding up a humanoid zombie. Apparently, this phoenix was a physical manifestation created by the zombie. The zombie wore a dilapidated red robe, and though his face was decomposing in many places, he had obviously been a young man. He was glaring at Xu Qing, his face twisted with rage. He let loose a howl as he blurred into motion. Appearing right in front of Xu Qing, he waved his hand, causing his cultivation base to flare to life. Instantly, a cloud of black snowflakes shot toward Xu Qing. At the same time, the phoenix released a piercing cry. Opening its mouth, it released a noxious aroma as it lunged forward to devour Xu Qing. The 11 faces that made its tail belched out a poison mist filled with horrendous maggots. Xu Qing's eyes narrowed. Backing up, he launched a fist strike with his right hand, creating a wild wind that blasted apart the snowflakes. Simultaneously, a sea of flames formed above him. The golden crow appeared in those flames, which then launched toward the phoenix. Xu Qing's shadow appeared behind him in the form of a massive tree with many eyes, all of them focused on the faces belching poison. In the blink of an eye, the two parties clashed, causing a string of deafening booms to fill the air. Over the course of the next few moments, they slammed into each other dozens of times. As that happened, Xu Qing's taboo poison spread. However, the zombie noticed, reached toward the underworld river, and caused the water there to spiral up and surround him. The countless souls within the water then fought back against Xu Qing's poison. It was similar to the method Chu Tianquan employed, except in comparison, there were far more underworld river souls. What was more, the river water was also the source of the zombie. Again, the zombie waved his hand, and the water formed a black python which swept toward Xu Qing. Xu Qing staggered backwards several dozen meters, his pupils constricting. There was something extremely gruish about this zombie. He seemed capable of drawing power from the underworld river. From what Xu Qing could sense, he had the strength of the early nascent soul stage, similar to Chu Tianquan. As Xu Qing fell back, the hell spirit Bloodwing appeared behind him. With its dramatic boost of speed, he tried to circle around the zombie. Considering the zombie's immense strength and gruish abilities, Xu Qing didn't want to waste time fighting him. Besides, he had the feeling he would need the power of the Violet Moon later, and didn't want to waste it too soon. However, as Xu Qing tried to speed past, the zombie turned and looked at him. The phoenix flapped its wings, giving it a burst of astonishing speed. It shot directly in front of Xu Qing like a lightning bolt. Xu Qing frowned as he again circled around and then sped on his way. However, the zombie wasn't ready to give up, and chased after him, howling as he prepared a deadly attack. Xu Qing's eyes flickered coldly. He waved his hand, causing 30 demonization symbols to fly out. He also activated his 7th heavenly palace. The symbols burned, and the Ghost Emperor rumbled into existence. The mere presence of the Ghost Emperor caused everything to tremble in the area. Water exploded and massive pressure weighed down. "Screw off," Xu Qing said, his eyes as cold as ice. He really didn't want to be entangled with this opponent, but it looked like he would have to waste some time to destroy him. The zombie sensed danger and suddenly stopped in place. Then it dropped down into the underworld river, where it glared up at Xu Qing. The water seethed around the zombie. Xu Qing looked at it coldly, then turned and sped off. The zombie watched Xu Qing go, hesitated for a moment, then sank back down into the water. That zombie must have been a top chosen when he was alive. Xu Qing put away the Ghost Emperor Mountain, then blurred further along toward the depths of the underworld river. A day later, which was his 5th in this major world, he finally reached the end of the river. There, he saw an enormous black palace. It was bigger than the county capital. Despite being dilapidated and falling apart, it emanated shocking pressure. Xu Qing got the sense that it was something from the profoundly ancient past. It was like some imperial palace that had existed in forgotten times. Boundless soul fluctuations emerged from within it, and it pulsed with an incredibly strong aura of death. What was more, in the depths of the palace there were mounds of black flesh that formed something like a mountain. Atop that mountain of flesh hovered a group of a few hundred souls, which were apparently some sort of offering. Beyond the souls, on the horizon, was a rift some several thousand meters wide. From the look of it, it was an eye hidden in the canopy of heaven. Though the eye was closed, it emanated godly might that caused everything in the area to ripple and distort. Waves of shock filled Xu Qing as he looked at the mountain of flesh in the imperial palace, as well as the hundreds of souls. He was still a great distance away, but from the tug of the golden thread, he knew for a certainty that Linger's soul was right there.